If you think you can shout at me and nothing happens, then you clearly don't know who you're talking to. I said it before I even realized my voice had crossed the line I was supposed to keep as a waitress at Romano's, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan. My name is Emily Carter, and for 3 years I had mastered the art of being invisible, of smiling through pressure, of carrying trays worth more than my monthly rent without ever letting my hands shake. That night was supposed to be like any other Friday night, the kind where the air smells like expensive wine and polished wood, where guests in tailored suits treat people like me as part of the furniture. But something felt different the moment he walked in. Vincent Moretti didn't enter a room, he changed it. Conversations lowered without permission, laughter thinned, and even the lighting seemed to feel sharper around him. He didn't look like the kind of man who needed attention, he looked like the kind of man who naturally collected it without trying. I noticed him only because I was forced to, carrying a tray past table 9 where a group of guests were already too loud, too comfortable in their arrogance. One of them snapped his fingers at me like I was late to my own obligation. I kept my expression neutral, because that's what I was trained to do, but inside something tightened. Then Vincent's voice cut through the room, calm but firm, not raised yet somehow louder than everything else. Enough. It wasn't aimed at me, but I felt it anyway, like the word had weight. The table fell silent for half a second before one of the guests tried to laugh it off, but even he stopped when Vincent's gaze shifted. It wasn't anger that I saw in Vincent's eyes, it was control, the kind that didn't need volume. I should have walked away at that moment, should have stayed small, invisible, safe. Instead, something in me snapped when another comment was thrown in my direction, dismissive, careless, like I wasn't standing right there. I turned back before I could stop myself. "Do not speak to me like I'm not here," I said, steady but sharp enough that even I felt the shift in the air. The guest blinked, surprised more than offended, but before he could respond, Vincent stood. Slowly. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just certain. His eyes found mine then, and for a second, everything else blurred. The room didn't feel big anymore, it felt focused, compressed into a moment I didn't understand. I expected anger. I expected consequences. Instead, there was silence. A long, unreadable pause where Vincent Moretti simply looked at me like I was something he hadn't accounted for. And then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "Interesting." That was all. One word. But it changed the entire night. The word "interesting" still lingered in the air long after Vincent Moretti said it, like the room itself had not decided how to respond. I turned away before my expression could betray anything, forcing my feet to move as if nothing unusual had happened, as if my pulse had not just shifted into something unfamiliar. That is what working at Romano's had taught me, how to disappear even while standing directly in front of people who believed they owned the space they were in. But tonight felt different, like the rules I had memorized no longer applied. I placed the tray down at the service station, hands steady on the surface even though my thoughts were not. Behind me, I could feel it, not eyes exactly, but attention. The kind that does not leave when you stop looking. "Emily, table 12 needs water and fresh wine glasses," my manager called out, voice tight with the pressure of the crowd. I nodded immediately, grateful for the excuse to move, to break the invisible thread that seemed to have formed between me and that corner of the room. As I walked, I passed by reflections in polished glass, catching glimpses of myself that looked too composed to match how I felt inside. When I reached table 12, the guests were already talking again, laughter returning in small waves, but it felt forced, like they were recovering from something they could not name. I refilled their glasses, offered polite words, and kept my gaze lowered. That is when I noticed him again. Vincent had not moved far. He stood near the edge of the main dining area, not sitting, not drinking, simply observing. The people around him adjusted without realizing it, giving him space as if it was instinct rather than choice. One of his associates leaned in to speak to him, but Vincent did not take his eyes off the room. Or maybe off me. I told myself it was nothing. Men like him did not fixate on people like me. They moved through worlds, not individuals. And yet, when I turned slightly to place a glass down, I felt it again, that same quiet weight of attention settling back into place. A customer at the bar called out for service, impatient, snapping me out of my thoughts. I moved toward him quickly, rehearsing my professional smile, but halfway there, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and controlled. I did not need to turn to know who it was. Vincent's voice came from just behind my right shoulder, calm and measured, not invasive, but close enough to make the space feel smaller. "You do not hesitate when people push you," he said. I paused, still holding the tray, unsure if I was meant to respond or continue walking. That was not a question I was used to hearing from someone like him. "I am at work," I finally said, keeping my tone neutral. "I do not have the luxury of hesitation." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like he was considering something I could not see. When I finally turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, I saw that same steady focus in his eyes, not judgment, not amusement, something more precise, like recognition of a pattern he had not expected to find here. "Most people confuse silence with weakness," he said quietly. I tightened my grip on the tray. "And most people confuse authority with entitlement," I replied before I could stop myself. For the first time that night, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it, like I had interrupted a thought he had been certain about. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side, giving me space to pass, but not breaking eye contact until I moved. As I walked away, I could feel the shape of the moment settling behind me, like it was not finished, only paused. And for reasons I did not yet understand, that thought made it harder to breathe than anything that had happened before. The rest of the evening at Romano's felt like it had shifted into a quieter version of itself, as if the entire restaurant was still functioning normally on the surface but something underneath had been rearranged. I kept moving from table to table, repeating the same gestures I had always relied on, refilling glasses, adjusting silverware, offering polite smiles that required no real emotion. But every movement now felt slightly delayed, like my awareness was split between the room and the memory of a voice that had not needed to be loud to be heard. Vincent Moretti had not approached me again, yet his presence had not left either. It was not something visible, not something I could point to, but something that changed how space felt when I crossed it. At one point, I caught him speaking with a man near the entrance, their conversation low and controlled, the kind of exchange that made people nearby instinctively step aside without knowing why. When Vincent laughed once, it was brief and without warmth, but it still made the air feel heavier for reasons I could not explain. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on clearing a table where a couple was finishing dessert, but I felt it again, that subtle pull of attention returning to me whenever I moved into his line of sight. I told myself it was my imagination, that exhaustion made people assign meaning to things that were not there. Then my manager called my name again, this time sharper than before, telling me to handle a spill near table 6. I walked quickly, aware of the small crowd that had formed, a guest upset, voice raised just enough to draw attention but not enough to fully disrupt the polished atmosphere. I approached carefully, offering apology and efficiency the way I had been trained, but the guest dismissed me immediately, speaking over me as if I were not part of the conversation. I felt the familiar pressure rise in my chest, the one that came from being reduced to something invisible again after just a brief moment of being seen. I lowered my gaze, ready to step back, when I heard movement behind me. Vincent was closer this time. Not suddenly, not intrusively, but deliberately, like he had chosen the exact distance he wanted to occupy in the room. He looked at the guest first, not me, and said nothing for a moment. That silence alone changed the dynamic instantly. The guest stopped talking mid-sentence, confusion replacing confidence as he registered who had entered the conversation. Vincent's voice came next, calm and even, not raised, not forceful, but absolute in a way that did not require repetition. "She is working," he said simply. "That is all you need from her." The guest hesitated, then muttered something under his breath and stepped back. It was over in seconds, but the shift it created lingered far longer. I did not look at Vincent immediately. I could feel my heartbeat steadying in a way that irritated me more than it should have. I had not asked for intervention, and yet it had happened without question. When I finally turned slightly, I expected to see indifference, or amusement, or even dismissal. Instead, Vincent was already watching me, as if he had been waiting for me to acknowledge him before leaving. There was no smile, no visible satisfaction in what he had done. Just that same focused attention, now quieter than before, as if something about the situation had confirmed an assumption he had not voiced. "You do not like being helped," he said. It was not a question. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice controlled. "I do not like being handled like I cannot handle myself." For a brief moment, something flickered across his expression again, subtle but present, like a shift behind a locked door. He studied me the way someone might study a decision they had not expected to consider. Then he nodded once, almost to himself, and stepped back just enough to give me space again. But as I walked away, I realized something had changed in the way he looked at me. It was no longer curiosity alone. It was something closer to interest that had found direction. The shift that happened after Vincent intervened did not leave the room immediately. It lingered in small, invisible ways, like a quiet adjustment no one openly acknowledged but everyone responded to. Conversations around Romanos resumed, but with less confidence, as if the atmosphere had been subtly corrected by something no one wanted to name. I kept working, telling myself to focus on the rhythm of the job, but I could still feel the imbalance between what I had expected tonight to be and what it had become. I was just finishing a table near the center of the dining room when I noticed Vincent had moved again. This time he was seated, but not fully relaxed, positioned in a way that still made him feel aware of everything around him. His associates stood at a respectful distance, speaking in low tones that never seemed to interrupt his attention. And yet, even while engaged with them, I felt it again, that return of focus toward me whenever I crossed into his peripheral space. It made no sense, and that was what made it harder to ignore. I told myself I was imagining patterns where there were none, that exhaustion and repetition had sharpened my awareness into something unreliable. But when I returned to the service station, I found a folded napkin waiting at the edge of the counter that I was certain had not been there before. There was no name on it, only a single line written in clean, deliberate handwriting: "You do not move like someone who accepts being ignored." My breath paused for a moment as I read it. I looked up instinctively, scanning the room until I found him again. Vincent was no longer speaking. He was watching. Not from afar, not absent-mindedly, but directly, as if he had already known I would notice. I placed the napkin down carefully, my thoughts tightening into something more alert than before. This was no longer about a single moment of intervention. It was intentional attention, sustained and directed in a way I could not easily dismiss. I moved back onto the floor, forcing myself to continue working, but everything felt slightly louder now: the clink of glassware, the low hum of conversation, even my own footsteps. When I passed near his table again, one of his associates stepped aside just enough for me to reach the edge without interruption. I refilled a glass, kept my posture steady, and avoided looking at him directly, but I could feel his presence anchored in the space beside me. Then, as I turned to leave, Vincent spoke again. Not loudly, not to draw attention, but clearly enough that only I could hear. "Tell me something," he said. I paused, tray still in hand, but did not turn fully. "Why did you not step back when he raised his voice earlier?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was invasive, but because it was precise. I hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Because I am not here to disappear," I said. There was a brief silence after that, one that felt heavier than anything that had been said before. When I finally glanced toward him, I saw no judgment in his expression, no approval either. Only focus, steady and unreadable, as if he was confirming something internally. "Most people mistake endurance for silence," he said after a moment. "And silence for weakness." I tightened my grip slightly on the tray, unsure why the conversation felt like it had shifted into something I had not agreed to but could not easily exit. "And most people mistake control for kindness," I replied without thinking. For the first time, something subtle changed in his expression again, not surprise, not amusement, but recognition that was deeper than either. He leaned back slightly, studying me as if I had stepped into a category he had not expected to exist in this space. Then he nodded once, slowly, as though accepting a conclusion that was still forming. "You are not what I expected tonight," he said quietly. I did not respond. I simply walked away, but the weight of that exchange followed me longer than any command or interruption had before, settling into the space between certainty and something I had not yet defined. The rest of the shift passed differently after that moment, as if the restaurant had quietly acknowledged that something underneath the surface had changed and no one had been given instructions on how to react. I continued moving through Romano's with the same practiced efficiency, but my awareness no longer belonged fully to the rhythm of work. It kept drifting back to Vincent Moretti, to the way he had spoken as if observing patterns instead of participating in conversation, to the way silence around him never felt empty, only controlled. I tried to dismiss it as overthinking, as my mind creating structure where there was none, but every time I passed near his section, that explanation became harder to maintain. He was still there, still composed, still speaking occasionally with the men beside him, yet every so often his attention would shift in my direction with the same quiet precision as before. Not disruptive. Not obvious. Just consistent enough to notice if you were paying attention. I was finishing closing duties at the service station when my coworker Daniel leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know who that is, right?" he asked. I hesitated only briefly. "A guest," I said. Daniel gave a short, uneasy laugh. "That is Vincent Moretti. People like that do not come here for dinner unless something else is going on." I did not respond. I did not ask what he meant. I did not want to give the conversation more weight than it already had. Instead, I focused on organizing the remaining receipts, trying to return my thoughts to something tangible. But even as I worked, I could feel the awareness of that name settling in differently than before, not because it changed what I had seen, but because it gave it context I had not asked for. When I finally stepped away from the service area to clear a table near the window, I saw Vincent had risen from his seat. He was not leaving. He was simply standing now, speaking briefly to one of his associates before dismissing him with a small motion of his hand. The man stepped away immediately, without hesitation. That alone should have been enough to make me focus on my work and keep distance. Instead, I found myself slowing slightly as I passed, tray balanced carefully, aware that the space between us felt more defined than before. When I reached the table, I began clearing dishes in silence, expecting nothing, wanting nothing but to finish the task and move on. But as I placed the final glass onto the tray, I heard his voice again, closer now than before. "Emily Carter," he said. Hearing my name in his voice made me pause. I turned slowly, fully this time, meeting his gaze without the buffer of movement or distraction. "Yes," I answered carefully. He studied me for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if confirming a detail he had already decided mattered. "You do not belong in the background," he said. The statement should have sounded simple, almost dismissive. Instead, it carried a weight I did not immediately know how to interpret. I tightened my grip on the tray. "I am exactly where I need to be," I replied. A brief silence followed. Around us, the restaurant continued its usual flow, but the space between his words and my response felt isolated from everything else. Vincent did not look away. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging my answer rather than accepting or rejecting it. "Most people believe that," he said. Then he added, almost quietly, "until someone notices them." I did not respond to that. I could not tell if it was a warning, a statement, or something else entirely. I only knew that when I finally turned away and walked back toward the service station, the feeling that I was being observed had changed shape. It was no longer just attention. It was intention. The moment I stepped away from the table, I could feel the shift in my awareness deepen, as if the entire evening had begun folding inward around a single point I could no longer ignore. Romano's was still operating as it always did, the soft clatter of dishes, the controlled movement of staff, the low hum of conversations from guests who believed they were separate from the world outside these walls. But I was no longer moving through it in the same way. Everything felt subtly recalibrated, like my attention had been tuned to a frequency I had not chosen. I kept telling myself it was nothing more than fatigue, that long shifts always made thoughts feel heavier than they were, yet every time I passed near Vincent Moretti's table, that explanation weakened. He was no longer speaking much. Instead, he was watching, not constantly, not in a way that drew attention from others, but with intervals so precise that I began to notice the pattern forming. Look away, speak briefly to someone beside him, then return to stillness. And each return seemed to land exactly where I happened to be in the room. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on clearing the final tables in my section. When I reached table 7, I noticed a glass had already been turned slightly toward the edge, as if someone had adjusted it intentionally. There was no reason for it to be there, yet it felt placed, not forgotten. I hesitated for only a second before picking it up. As I did, I heard footsteps approaching from behind me, measured and unhurried. I did not need to turn to know it was him. Vincent stopped just within a reasonable distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but not so close that it would be considered intrusive in a public space. "You noticed patterns quickly," he said. I placed the glass on my tray before responding, keeping my tone controlled. "It is part of the job. You notice everything or you miss the details that matter." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. "Most people do not see details," he replied. "They see roles." I finally turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him without fully committing my attention. "And what do you see," I asked, "when you look at people like me?" The question hung between us longer than I expected. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, but within that small space, everything felt suspended. Vincent did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze moved briefly past me, toward the rest of the room, then returned with the same steady focus. "I see choices," he said at last. "And I see what happens when people are forced to make them without permission." The answer was not what I expected, and for a moment I did not know how to respond. It did not sound like observation alone. It sounded like experience. I turned back to my work, finishing the table without speaking, but the silence that followed felt different from the silences before. It was no longer empty. It was structured, like something had been placed inside it and left there intentionally. When I returned to the service station, Daniel was already there, checking the final receipts before closing out the register. He looked at me briefly, then toward Vincent's table. "He has not taken his attention off you since he arrived," Daniel said quietly. I frowned slightly. "That is not possible." Daniel shrugged. "It is not normal, either." I did not respond. Instead, I focused on organizing the last of my station, preparing to end my shift. But even as I worked, I felt it again, that presence of awareness behind me, steady and unbroken. When I finally glanced back toward the dining area, Vincent was no longer seated. He was standing near the exit now, coat in hand, speaking briefly with one of his associates. But just before he left, his eyes met mine one last time across the room. There was no gesture, no signal, no change in expression that others would notice. Only a single moment of recognition that felt more final than anything that had happened before. Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence that did not immediately fade. The moment Vincent Moretti walked out of Romano's, the atmosphere inside did not immediately return to normal. It should have. The doors closed, the night continued, and guests slowly resumed their conversations as if nothing unusual had happened. But I could still feel the residue of his presence, like a pressure that did not leave just because the source was gone. I finished my closing duties in silence, moving through the final steps of the shift with mechanical precision, stacking trays, wiping down counters, logging the last receipts. Daniel had already left, and most of the staff had scattered into the night, but I stayed a little longer than necessary, partly out of habit, partly because something in me still felt unfinished. When I finally stepped outside, the air was colder than I expected, sharp enough to pull me fully back into the present. New York at night always felt different after a long shift, quieter in a way that made every sound feel more distant. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and started walking toward the subway entrance, replaying fragments of the evening in my mind even though I told myself not to. The way he had looked at me. The way he spoke as if noticing things other people did not. The way silence around him never felt empty. I told myself it meant nothing, that people like him were used to control, and attention followed them naturally. But even as I tried to dismiss it, I could not fully remove the feeling that something had been placed into motion without my agreement. I had walked halfway down the block when I heard a car slow beside the curb. I did not look at first. In this part of the city, you learn not to react to everything. But when the engine stayed close instead of moving on, I slowed slightly, cautious without fully stopping. The passenger window lowered quietly, and I saw him. Vincent was inside. Not in a dramatic way, not surrounded by chaos or attention, just seated in the back of a black car that blended into the street as if it had always belonged there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city moved around us, people passing, lights changing, traffic continuing, but that space between the car and the sidewalk felt separate from everything else. "Get in," he said simply. There was no force in the words, no urgency, just certainty. I did not move immediately. My grip tightened slightly on the strap of my bag. "I am going home," I replied. He studied me for a brief moment, his expression unchanged, but something in his attention felt more focused than before. "You are already home," he said quietly, as if correcting something I had misunderstood. I frowned slightly. "That does not make sense." "It does," he replied. "You just have not adjusted your definition yet." The statement should have sounded dismissive. Instead, it felt deliberate, like it was meant to sit in my mind rather than end the conversation. I should have kept walking. I knew that. Every instinct I had built from years of working in places where you kept distance from people like him told me not to engage, not to pause, not to allow space for whatever this was becoming. But I found myself still standing there, not moving forward, not moving away. Vincent leaned slightly closer to the open window, his voice still calm. "Earlier tonight, you said you are not here to disappear," he said. I nodded slowly. "I meant it." "I know," he replied. That was all he said, but the way he said it made it feel like a conclusion rather than an observation. There was a brief silence again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt like something had already been decided within it. I looked toward the subway entrance down the street, then back at the car. The rational part of me told me to leave, to end the interaction, to return to the life that existed before this evening. But something about the way he was watching me made it harder to separate what was normal from what had already shifted. Finally, I spoke again. "People like you do not usually stop for people like me," I said. Vincent's expression did not change, but his answer came immediately. "People like me do not usually notice people like you," he said. And then, after a pause that felt heavier than the words before it, he added, "That is the difference." The car remained beside the curb longer than I expected, as if time itself had slowed down around the space between Vincent Moretti and me. I stood there still, aware that every rational thought I had developed over years of work and survival was telling me to turn away, to continue walking toward the subway, to end whatever invisible thread had formed between us before it tightened any further. But I did not move. Vincent waited without urgency, his presence inside the car unchanged, composed, as if he already knew what decision I would make before I made it. The city continued around us, headlights passing, distant voices fading into the rhythm of New York nightlife, but none of it felt fully connected to this moment anymore. Finally, I exhaled slowly and stepped forward. I opened the back door of the car and slid inside, closing it quietly behind me. The interior was calm, almost minimal, nothing unnecessary, nothing that did not serve a purpose. Vincent did not turn immediately. He simply gave a slight motion for the driver to move, and the car pulled away from the curb with steady precision. I adjusted my posture, keeping distance without thinking about it. "Where are we going?" I asked. He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window for a moment as the city lights reflected across the glass. "Somewhere you will not feel like you are working," he said. I frowned slightly. "I am not working now." That earned a brief glance from him, subtle but direct. "You never stopped," he replied. The statement should have felt intrusive, but it landed differently, as if it was not an accusation but an observation he had already confirmed. I turned my gaze toward the passing streets, unsure how to respond to that level of certainty from someone I barely understood. There was a silence after that, not uncomfortable, but structured, like it had its own shape inside the space of the car. After several blocks, I finally spoke again. Why did you stop the car? I asked. Vincent's attention shifted back toward me slowly, measured. Because you did not leave when you had the chance, he said. I hesitated. That is not a reason. It is the only reason that matters, he replied. His tone remained calm, but there was something final in it, like he was stating a rule rather than a preference. I studied him more carefully now, noticing details I had ignored before. The stillness in the way he sat, the absence of unnecessary movement, the way even silence seemed organized around him. He was not restless. He was controlled in a way that made everything around him feel slightly less controlled by comparison. People do not usually ask me to get into their car, I said quietly. I did not ask, he replied. I allowed you the choice. That distinction made me pause. I did not know why it mattered, but it did. The car turned onto a quieter street, the city noise softening slightly as we moved farther from the main avenues. I noticed my own reflection in the window, faint and layered over the lights outside, and for a moment I did not recognize the version of myself sitting there. You are not what I expected either, I admitted after a moment. Vincent did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was lower than before. That is because you expected to be ignored, he said. I turned slightly toward him. Most people do ignore me. Most people do not see what is in front of them, he replied. The words settled between us, not heavy, but precise. I looked away again, unsure why that felt more honest than anything else that had been said all night. The car continued forward, smooth and steady, until I realized I was no longer thinking about where it was going. I was thinking about the fact that I had not asked him to stop. The car slowed before I realized we had arrived. The motion shifted subtly, a gradual easing rather than a stop that demanded attention. I looked out through the window and saw a building that did not match anything I had expected. It was not extravagant in the way I associated with wealth, but it carried a quiet structure, clean lines, controlled lighting, and a sense of intentional privacy that separated it from the rest of the city. The driver came to a complete stop at a private entrance. I did not move immediately. Vincent stepped out first, as if the moment required no hesitation from him, then opened my door without waiting for a request. I hesitated only briefly before stepping out onto the sidewalk. The air here was different, quieter, as if the city's noise had been filtered out before reaching this space. I adjusted my coat instinctively, suddenly aware that I had followed someone I barely understood into a place I had never been invited to before tonight. Vincent did not rush me. He simply walked ahead a few steps, then paused, waiting without turning around completely. I followed. Inside, the building was calm, almost minimal in design, with soft lighting and polished surfaces that reflected movement without distortion. There were no crowds, no noise, only a controlled stillness that felt deliberate rather than empty. We passed through a corridor where a single security presence acknowledged Vincent with a brief nod, but no words were exchanged. I noticed how easily he moved through the space, not as a guest, but as someone whose presence required no explanation. We stopped near an elevator that opened immediately without a visible request. I stepped inside after him, still silent, still trying to understand why I had not chosen to leave earlier when I had every opportunity. The doors closed quietly. The ascent was smooth, almost unnoticeable except for the shift in pressure. Vincent leaned slightly against the wall, not relaxed, but still in control of his posture, his attention no longer scanning outward, but focused inward in a way that made the silence between us feel structured again. You did not ask where I was taking you, he said finally. I looked at him. I assumed you would tell me when it mattered. He studied me for a moment, as if evaluating the answer rather than accepting it. Most people would have left the car, he said. Most people do not get into it in the first place, I replied. That earned the faintest pause from him, not surprise, but acknowledgement. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors opened onto a private floor. I stepped out first this time, unsure why the instinct felt correct. The space beyond was quieter still, not empty, but intentionally limited, like everything present had been placed there with purpose. Vincent followed without urgency. There were no introductions, no explanations, only a door at the end of the hallway that he opened without hesitation. Inside, the room was simple but expansive, with large windows overlooking the city below. The skyline stretched across the glass like a quiet reflection of distance and control. I stopped just inside the threshold. "I do not understand what this is," I said. Vincent remained near the entrance, not blocking it, not closing distance unnecessarily. "You will not understand it immediately," he said. "That is not the purpose." I turned slightly toward him. "Then what is the purpose?" He paused, just long enough for the question to settle. "You were right earlier," he said. "When you said you are not here to disappear." I held his gaze, waiting. "This is where people stop trying to make you invisible," he continued. The words did not feel like persuasion. They felt like structure, like something already in place rather than something being offered. I looked back toward the windows, toward the city spread far below, then slowly back at him. For the first time since the beginning of the night, I understood something clearly. It was not that I had been brought here. It was that I had not been removed. And that distinction, more than anything else, changed everything.